I'd like to refocus now on our upcoming presenters, and I'm very excited to share with you that we have an incredible selection in front of you today. Up next, we have a presenter named Paula Penn-Nabrit. She will be presenting community garden partnerships for increasing equity and food access. Our pleasure to have her here today. Miss Penn-Nabrit is a graduate of Columbia School for Girls, Wesley College, and the Ohio State University Moritz College of Law. She is the mother of 3 sons and a beloved daughter-in-law, and a wife of the late Charles Madison Nabrit. She is the author of many scholarly papers and books, including Morning by Morning, How We Homeschooled Our African American Sons to the Ivy League. In 2014, Paula and her sons founded the Charles Madison Nabrit Memorial Garden on the property of the Christ Church. There will be a Q&A following her presentation, so please post your questions in the chat. Ms. Penn-Nabrit will also participate in the panel discussion at 4 p.m. Please welcome entrepreneur, activist, author, and gardener, Paula Penn-Nabrit.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I want to begin by thanking you for including me in the program. And I would also, I'm working to make sure I can share my screen accurately, and I hope that you all can see it. I want to begin with a couple of pieces of information and basically around photographs, and then we'll move into sort of the text of what I wanted to talk about. So I was very much intrigued by the earlier speakers and this issue about biodiversity and cross-pollination and how it benefits all carbon-based life forms. And you'll notice I've included a few hashtags there that drive our work. 1, he started us in a garden for a reason. 2, we were brought here to cultivate. And 3, we fight urban food apartheid. And follow that with a quote that I'll talk about in more detail later. But gardening is like parenting and pasturing, all require the same daily attention to detail in the same posture of humility, head bowed, body bent. And that was something that my husband,
you mean to be sharing screen?
I beg your pardon?
You mean to be sharing screen right now?
Oh, I thought that I was. All right, I'm sorry. Let me try that again. I was feeling very smug there.
Oh, you're wonderful. I just want to make sure.
Okay, let me try this again. Okay, so let's go to share screen. And is that working?
Yes.
Is that working? Okay, great. So, okay.
So you'll probably want to put that in presenter view, and then you'll be ready to go. So there's that button up there that says present. And
yes.
Great.
All right. So am I in the correct space now?
Yes.
Okay, good. So this is what we're talking about, biodiversity, cross-pollination, and how it actually does benefit all carbon-based life forms. So again, these 3 hashtags, he started us in a garden for a reason. We were brought here to cultivate, and we fight urban food apartheid. And this quote that really has been a lodestar. Gardening is like parenting and pasturing, all require the same daily attention to detail in the same posture of humility, head bowed, body bent. So this is a snapshot of the garden several years ago. It's expanded beyond that, but I think this gives you a good visual image of this biodiversity, because this is a space in which we grow flowers, herbs, vegetables, and fruit intentionally. So it's as much as we are interested in production of food because of the community in which we serve, but we are also very much interested in the idea of growing this food in a way that is clean and healthy. And so the biodiversity assists in that process. And then the historical piece of this is, these are two photographs, one of my maternal great-grandmother, Hattie Edwards, and the other is a photograph of my late husband's paternal grandparents. One of the fun facts that we discovered early on was that both my maternal great-grandmother and his paternal grandfather were in college at the same time. They were both in the class of 1898. She was at Bluefield State Teachers College and he was at Morehouse. And so when we had our children, part of what Charles really saw was that they were in fact heirloom seeds. Both of us are from families that have been in this country since the late 1700s. Both of us are from families that have been pursuing lifelong marriages and post-secondary education as long as it's been legal for Black people to do so. And so the idea about how one navigates in this space of imperialism and colonialism and systems of white supremacy and patriarchy are things that we've examined not just in an academic or theoretical construct, but in a pragmatic one. And it definitely informs his approach to food. And that was something that he then transmitted to me. So when we began this memorial garden, essentially is free grief therapy. And in this top photograph, you'll see my older two, the twins, Charles and Damon, putting in the above ground drip irrigation system. This next photograph is how the beds were cordoned off for square foot gardening. We do seed starting, and here are photographs of my nephews involved in the actual construction of this space. And again, the biodiversity piece is important, not just in terms of maximizing yield and productivity. And when we talk about productivity, again, we're not just talking about quantity, we're really talking about the quality of the foods that we are producing and then putting into the community. And so when we look at what happens with also the food of the soul, the aesthetics of this space, it's also very, very important to us. And then we do have a pretty nice bounty. And we made a decision early on that the produce that we grew, we would sell at an on-site farmer's market for $1 a pound. And that's been a consistent issue from the inception of the garden. And then we also have this biodiversity of people, not just plants. And so we have in this one photograph here, Mr. Ringo, who, as he was working, said to me, "Oh, you remind me of my grandmother and work at George Washington Carver, with George Washington Carver." And I said, "So how old are you?" And then we have very young children who are in this space as well, and ages in between. So that when we're looking at how do we bring people into these spaces of healing, into these spaces of regenerative growth in community, how do we begin this process of structurally dismantling systems of white supremacy and the way in which it fuels urban food apartheid? Part of it is by expanding the community of people that are involved in this work. And so that's not an accidental piece. And there are reasons why we have benches throughout the garden space. At our church, at the Church of Christ of the Apostolic Faith, the congregation was formed 110 years ago. We have so many senior citizens in our congregation that we do not announce your birthday unless you're 90, because otherwise we wouldn't be doing anything else. And when we have these elders in this space, their ability to engage young people their ability to find comfort and tranquility in this space is something that cannot be overstated. And so in this photograph here, we have Sister Cecily. Sister Cecily was probably 91 years old when this photograph was taken. And this is a photograph of my mother. In this photograph, Sister Cecily is with my son, Charles. In this photograph, this is my mother, who is almost 91 now. And here she is with a group of interns from the Charles Young Buffalo Soldiers Monument. They are students at HBCUs, both Central State University and Wilberforce. And so again, this idea of young people engaging with elders is something that we know is an important aspect of biodiversity. Here we have another element of this diversity, which is the students and faculty from the College of Engineering at Ohio State University. And so in this first photograph, you can see that Chris Radcliffe, who is the instructor, and these students are installing and working on the structural elements of a farm bot, which is the simple explanation I can give is that you have a raised bed, and then there's a robotic arm, and this robotic arm moves the length of the bed, and it can plant, it can check and measure soil moisture. It identifies anything that was not planted as a weed, and it sends a text when the crop is ready to be harvested. Charles and Damon were very much interested in having a farm bot, because they're geeky like their father and were very interested in the science and technology. I was interested because when we see instances of urban food apartheid, those don't exist independently. Those are attendant to not only disparities in health and disparities in employment and economic disparities, but also disparities in educational access. And so when our own children were in fact children, my husband and I invested a lot of time in making sure that they had opportunities for things like oceanography camp, engineering camp, and space camp. The idea of engaging broadly, and that's expensive. So by having something like this farm bot at the garden makes this kind of science and technology easily accessible. In this other photograph, you'll see that this is Professor David Delane on the ladder with my other son, Damon, and they are working on the construction of the hoop house. And the hoop house was acquired through a USDA funded and Mid-Ohio Food Bank administered grant. And so when we think about that, so this photograph here is at the opening of the garden in 2014, and then we see these ongoing images. So this was the first set of slides that I wanted to show you, but I also wanted to share another set of slides, and I'm hoping that I can get back to my primary screen so that I can switch over. I'm having a little bit of difficulty in that I normally don't do the tech piece on this. This is something that usually my son Damon does, but he is not available today. So the other piece that I wanted to share with you is where we are now. So that was the backstory of where we started. And now I would like to share with you the slides of what is happening right now. And so I hope I'm doing this correctly. Where we are. Are you able to see that slide?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay. So this is, again, a little bit more information about the farm bot. And again, you can see the work of these students. I'm going to try to do this more slowly. Part of what is intriguing here in terms of biodiversity and cross-pollination I'm very excited about having the children in our community see the process that as we come up with new ideas and new ideologies around how we engage, that it's not a simple fix. One of the things that I think is often overlooked is what happens in process. Here we see the solar component, looking at alternate forms of energy, looking at ways to move beyond a reliance on fossil fuel, and why that matters, not just at a global level, not just at an academic level, but why that matters in communities that are already disenfranchised economically, looking for ways to reduce what is paid for fuel and energy and power sources is a functional issue that we are very much interested in. We also are looking at the signage piece because we run a summer day camp that's free. And the title of our camp is STEM to STEAM, It's All in the Garden. And so when children come to this space, we want to make sure that the elements of coding, the elements involved with composting, the elements involved in vermiculture, that we're not just having children come into this space and having a one-off experience, but that they're also being engaged fully, holistically, spiritually, intellectually, and physically. So then we have the hydroponics. So inside the hoop house, which is now enclosed, the students are building a hydroponic system. And that will allow us to expand and extend our growing season so that we are not limited to just the summer. We have water catchment systems so that we have spent a lot of time working with the children around issues of water conservation. And during the summer day camps, we build oyas that they plant with certain plants, but we needed to do this on a larger scale. And so again, the idea of being self-sustaining, to the extent that we can move away from a dependency on city water supplies and using rainwater and preserving that's a big important issue for us as well. And so one of the students at the College of Engineering donated, actually his parents and grandparents donated these 3 large water catchment systems. So the students have been doing this work around composting, various forms of composting and water conservation, and they're building the composting system. We've been doing composting since we opened the garden in 2014, but this gives us another layer of engagement with the students, both at the College of Engineering and the students who come to our summer day camp. So having that cross-pollination of experience is something that we see as important in terms of moving us forward and away from an overt dependency and reducing the negative impacts that we're having on the planet locally in our own community. We're putting down ground cover, and then that will be covered with gravel to keep the weeds under control without using any kind of negative chemicals. And also that helps us with integrative pest management, again, without using pesticides. So you can see this is how part of it looks after the ground cover has been put down, and then the gravel. And these are students from an OSU club, Nourish, who have been very much involved in this work in the garden. So, and these are we planted a lot of tulips. We planted a lot of flowers because again, the cross-pollination requires that we have all of these different kinds of life forms vibrant in this space. But the other part of it beyond the sort of biological element is the aesthetics. We really value the impact of beauty in our spaces where people live. And often I think there's an unstated presumption that if people are poor, they either don't need or don't deserve or don't appreciate aesthetic beauty. And so that is something that we push back against pretty strongly. So we spend a great deal of time and energy, not just planting asparagus, everything from asparagus to zucchini. So we grow asparagus, Brussels sprout, broccoli, sugar snap peas, green beans, tomatoes, cantaloupe, honeydew, tomatillos, tomatoes, zucchini. We grow a lot of vegetables and a good amount of fruit. We have strawberries, blueberries, blackberries, raspberries. But we also grow a lot of flowers, tulips, roses, daffodils, hibiscus, gardenias. Having a space of beauty is an important thing. We also have a lot of wood that we had somebody chop up for us. We had a couple of black walnut trees that had to be removed because they were creating a canopy over the garden. But we're also doing some baseline things. So just like we have the technology with the FarmBot and the solar panel, we are also doing very direct work in the garden with planting and weeding. And these are tasks that we start early in the season so that when the summer day camp happens, there are already beds ready for the children, some to plant. There will be some that will be ready to harvest, and learning how to plant, how to weed, how to water, how to harvest. These are skills that we want to pass on to this next generation. And these are some of the peonies. This is the lavender. We have 2 large herb beds. When we do cooking demonstrations, we really try to talk about how food can be seasoned without an over-reliance on salt, which is an issue in our community with high blood pressure and with diabetes. Roses, our strawberries, we often don't have a big harvest because when children come to the garden to work, they also tend to eat everything. So that's a review of the last 7 years. We've also had a lot of concerts with Columbus Urban Strings. We've had concerts with Blue Spectrum, which is an incredible group of blues musicians led by Zane Harshaw. He and the other members of this group, almost all of these young people are on the autism spectrum. We've also screened films, including Seed, The Untold Story, and Can You Dig This? We've also had conferences with national speakers like Frederick Douglass Opie, who wrote Zora Neale Hurston on Florida food, recipes, remedies, and simple pleasures, and Reverend Dr. Rita Weems, who gave a really compelling talk on God planted the first garden. And as I mentioned earlier, Reverend Dr. Heber Brown of the Black Church Food Security Network. And also Jason Brown, a former NFL star who became a farmer. As you might imagine, that was a big draw. But we are really right now most excited about being able to continue our summer day camp. Obviously, we weren't able to do it last year because of COVID. But part of what I think is important about this camp experience is, if I can share the screen better. I'm having real problems with this, but these children are not just doing the science and the technology with the robotics and the coding, and those things are important. I'm not attempting to minimize those, but we are equally focused on the arts component, and that was a critical piece for the children, as well as having people like Nathan Harris, who's about to get his PhD in engineering, engaging with the children. And so, and again, the work of harvesting And each day began and ends with a gratitude circle, followed by prayer and laughter yoga. I'm a big proponent of laughter yoga, and we had children from ages 4 to 14. And so the issue of intentionality and having a gratitude circle are really important skills for children to learn so that they can modulate their own spiritual and emotional well-being, even as they are existing in spaces that, quite frankly, are not safe. Right? These are not safe spaces for Black people, and that includes Black children. And so helping children learn how to turn inward and to tap into the spiritual power that they have, the power that our ancestors used to survive, that's an important skill set. We also always have children who become so enamored with the process, they take plants home. We keep extra planters so that when children want to start seeds and take them home, we are delighted. We're delighted to do that. So again, this is another example of some of the floral issues. So we have hibiscus, and we try to make it a fun space also. So it's not just work. So some of it's whimsical. We've got things growing in sinks and in boots, lots of different ways for children to think about how to grow. And of course, if you're going to camp, you should have stuff, right? So hats and book bags and journals and paint sets, those all of that, all of those things we're able to provide. So, and still keep it free. That's an important piece. We're also working on a coloring book for them. And that's, so how we make it happen is the spiritual and physical connections are through, again, the church, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. The community connections are through organizations like Franklin Park Conservatory, Lowe's of Central Columbus, Kirch Brothers, United Way of Central Ohio, and the Greater Columbus Growing Coalition, GCGC. There are government and NGO connections with FarmsSHARE, farms serving health and racial equity. And FarmsSHARE is the reason that we're able to have a seasonal, weekly, vibrant on-site farmers market where we are selling the produce for $1 a pound, because we're then partnered with Richland Grow Op, which is a cooperative of farmers in Mansfield, Ohio. And then there's the intellectual and physical connections with the Ohio State University, both with the Initiative for Food and Agricultural Transformation, the INFACT program, and the Buckeye ISA, Institution Supported Agriculture. And those are both supported through Kellogg Foundation grants. And then we work closely with the College of Food, Agriculture, and Environmental Sciences, OSU Extension, the College of Engineering, and the Knowledge Exchange. And we have tons of social media supporters, and I sell my books. And that's another way that we help support and sustain the garden. And so those are sort of the visual images. The other thing that I really sort of wanted to talk about, and I think it intersects with the earlier presentations about the cultural components of this work. And from my perspective, it's a spiritual and a cultural piece. And one of the things that I often, when people buy one of my books, one of the inscriptions that I always write is from Psalms 118:23, ours, "This is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes." So basically, when we talk about what's happened at the Charles Madison Neighborhood Memorial Garden, it's a story of a family and a church and a land grant institution. So yeah, it's my family, it's the Church of Christ, the Apostolic Faith, and it's the Ohio State University. And that work that these entities are engaged in in disrupting and dismantling urban food apartheid. That's my goal. And that's a lot, but I think what's exciting is this can be reproduced. And that's part of what we've been working on. We have a journal article now that we're waiting to find out if it's going to be published, that Damon and Charles, my oldest two sons, and I have worked on with Dr. David Delane and Dr. Chris Ratcliffe and Nathan Harris, all at the College of Engineering, on looking at collaborative inquiry. So I think to put this really in context about why I think this is so powerful and why I'm so convinced that this can be reproduced is that this issue, and when I started off with those images of my great grandmother and Charles's grandfather, that was a fun fact to find out that we both had relatives who were going to college in the late 1800s. But I think that beyond that, this idea about how one sees oneself in community, how one sees oneself in the trajectory, and this issue about how one sees one's future. And so when we had our children, Charles saw them as heirloom seeds, being very, very cognizant of where we had already come from as a people, having experienced colonization, having experienced chattel slavery, having experienced Reconstruction, having experienced the Civil Rights Movement, having experienced militarized policing and mass incarceration. What does that mean when you are talking about a people who have been in a place in the land of your nativity now since the late 1700s? And what are the skills that have been acquired that can be transmitted? And some of it is in the production of one's own food, the control of one's own food supply, because of course, food is a way in which control has been exhibited historically against enslaved people. And so when we had our children, I was in law school when Damon and Charles were born. And so when they graduated, I was 13, they were 13 months old when I graduated. And Charles, I had nursed them the first year and was starting to buy baby food. And Charles said, yeah, we don't know who bottled that. We need to grow our own food. And I thought, that's crazy. And who do you think has time to do that? And his position was, parenting is like pastoring and gardening. It all requires the same daily attention to detail and the same posture of humility, head bowed, body bent. So people don't have time to garden, probably don't have time to parent. And that was a real paradigm shift. And so we continued gardening. We started gardening as a family. Damon and Charles were 2 when we had their youngest brother, Evan. And so throughout the years, as we did the traditional corporate thing, we were relocated with different jobs. We worked on AT&T's divestiture project. We ultimately started our own business. We homeschooled our kids. But through all of that, we were always maintaining some kind of a garden. And so when he died, we'd been married for 36 years, 8 months, and 22 days. And so building a memorial garden made sense, but it was not, I did not envision it as it has come to be. And so part of what I wanted to talk about is the location. So the USDA Economic Research Service identifies our zip code at the church as a low income, low access urban food desert, because 33% of the households are at or below the poverty line. 13% don't have access to a car, and the closest supermarkets are 4.3 miles away. I'm going to stop sharing the screen right now so I can see people who are actually in the session. I think that would be better. And so as I said, the closest supermarkets are Trader Joe's and Whole Foods. So even if you could afford that, who wants to schlep 4 miles each way to do grocery shopping? And so we really began thinking about this idea of changing this language from urban food desert to urban food apartheid to really accurately reflect the institutionalized nature of what was happening. And then beyond naming it, and that is important to name the thing what it is, but then to really think about what are the ways in which that can be dismantled. And sometimes the dismantling of institutionalized systems can seem so enormous that it's overwhelming. We decided to really do that basic low level process. And so we thought, in this neighborhood, in this community, we will take the food that we grow and we will make it accessible and affordable. So the farmers market is on site. People can walk over and they can say, I'd like a pound of collard greens. I'd like 3 pounds of sugar snap peas. I'd like 2 pounds of tomatoes. And we harvest the food on demand. The other benefit of that is, as I said earlier, we have benches throughout the garden. Because we don't have storage, when people want food, they have to wait for us to harvest it. And what ends up happening is that people have conversations and engagements across communities that they normally would not intersect with. So, for example, I went to Columbus School for Girls, and I also did my undergraduate work at Wellesley College. And I went to law school at Ohio State. Some of the people that I know from CSG or from Wellesley come to the garden because where else are you going to get organic leeks for $1 a pound? Nowhere. Meanwhile, there are people in the community who are coming because they want okra, and they want organic okra, or they want collard greens. These are communities that would not normally intersect. But while people are waiting for me to harvest their leeks, or they're waiting for me to harvest their collard greens, they are sitting in community with one another. And often people come planning to only stay 5 or 10 minutes, and they find themselves 2 hours later, and they'll say, I don't even know what happened. I don't even know what happened. That's the benefit of biodiversity and cross-pollination. And so when we think about how we structured this garden initially, this is the element of the divine. I think sometimes we have a vision, and the vision doesn't come to a collective, right? And everyone doesn't necessarily see it. If everybody sees it, it's not a vision, right? That's kind of a hint. If everybody gets it at the same time, it's probably not a vision. But this idea of how the garden was designed, before we ever thought that we would have different communities of people here, was insightful. So the garden was built with 700 feet of untreated lumber, and they were lined, those beds were lined with cardboard for organic weed control and filled with 40 tons of organic soil. There is an above ground drip irrigation system on a solar powered timer. The 4-foot pathways between the beds are lined with cardboard. The drip line hosing is over the cardboard and covered with 40 tons of pea gravel. So that when we talk about increased access to affordable organic food, when we talk about increased children's exposure to STEM studies, we talk about increased cultural connections to food cultivation and increased spiritual connections to gardening. Those ideas are seen in the hashtags. And so when we talk about spiritual and cultural connections, here's my analysis of that. And this part is more difficult to talk about than the science of cross-pollination. It's more difficult than talking about the issue of organic food or even urban food apartheid. It's very difficult when we start talking about spiritual and religious traditions of Black people in the United States, right? But I think it's critical to this issue of sustainability. The question of how is it that people have been able to navigate in this space of overt hostility for generations? How does that happen? How does that happen? And so This element of our mission, increasing spiritual connections to gardening, intersects with our fourth hashtag, which is He started us in a garden for a reason. So again, almost every Black church I know has a food pantry and or free food giveaways. And that's great. I mean, I know sometimes those are necessities. But have you ever noticed how often it looks like these food pantries look like the Civil War just ended and this is the Freedmen's Bureau? And we see lines and lines of Black people waiting for a cardboard box of food that would otherwise have been disposed of. And the people who are donating that food are getting a tax write-off. And one thing that we know is giving people a box of food is not a way to systemically address food insecurities. And so I've been curious about that. And as somebody who grew up in an apostolic Pentecostal church, you know, we look to the scriptures for an answer for everything. And so part of what I thought about is, why don't churches have gardens? Why don't churches have gardens? And so I began looking again at Genesis in the 2nd chapter, and says, the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And the Lord planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the man whom he had formed. And the Lord God took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden to dress it and to keep it. And what's interesting about that is, no matter where you may be on the Abrahamic tradition of Christianity, Judaism, or Islam, and even outside of the Abrahamic tradition, when we look at the teachings of Hinduism, when we look at the teachings of Buddha, we see these recurring themes of gardens as places of health and healing. Right? We see this as a common thematic. And yet, even in the most quote unquote fundamentalist of Christian churches, we don't see gardens. And that seems oddly inconsistent to me. And so this kind of hands-on approach that we see in Genesis is in sharp contrast to everything else that happens in the beginning, right? Because everything else is spoken, right? God said, let there be light, there's light. Let there be firmament in the water, there was. Let the waters be gathered into one place, and it was. Everything is spoken until we get to the garden. And that's when we see this movement from speaking to doing. And what does that mean? What does that mean for us as we explore this linkage, this intersectionality between spiritual and religious traditions and cultural traditions that sustain us? And so I think that what does it mean that when it came to our humanity and our dwelling place, that God put his actual hand to the task? What does it mean that Eden, the first garden prototype, was important enough for God to actually plant it and not speak it into existence? I think there's certainly lots of theories that one could offer, but I think that the phenomenal work of creation that happens in a garden is life-giving. You know, when you see children plant peas and then they come back and it's an actual pea. When they plant radish seeds and they come back and it's an actual radish. I mean, it's like an actual radish. That is life-giving and sustaining, and it's a way of renewing a sense of connection to the universe and to the spiritual and to the divine. And I think too often we are disconnected. I also think there's a reason that God formed the human family from soil and then personally planted a garden in which to place them in that same soil. And how important it is for children to understand what soil health means. And when we had the garden, when we had the camp 2 years ago, and we had our pastor was brand new then, and he came out one day and said, "Oh, I see you all. Are you having fun playing in the dirt?" And one of the little girls who was like 6 said, "This isn't dirt. This is soil. Soil is a living thing." We need to know that we need to be reminded of our connections to the earth. And I think the discipline that is needed to dress a garden, to adorn it, to beautify it, to cultivate it, to embellish it, to improve it, fosters strategic thinking. You plan a garden. You plan in January what you're going to be planting in May. You plan what seeds you're going to start in your house. You plan when you're going to harden them off. You plan when you're going to do the transplanting. This kind of strategic thinking is not just a skill set, but it is also a way in which to instill peace and tranquility, as opposed to this sense of, I don't know what's going to happen next. I have no agency. I have no agency. And so, and I also think that the work in a garden is a very effective witness. I think that this whole idea about how people come into a space because work is happening and it's a work of creation, I think that is something that humans respond to. And I also think that it's important to point out that, again, God could have started the human family anywhere. A tent, a tabernacle, a mosque, a church, a cathedral. The decision to start the human family in a garden means something. And I think that there's no better place to learn the lesson of Ecclesiastes. To everything there is a season, a time to every purpose under the heaven, a time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to pluck up that which is planted. I think that understanding strategically that this is a process, that we are part of a continuum, right? That we are part of the ongoing experience of humanity, that we are part of our family, our culture, that we have been here. That's one of the beautiful things I think that happens in a church like mine, where my children are fifth generation worshiping together with people who knew their parents, their grandparents, their great grandparents, their great great grandparents. That's like money in the bank, that sense of who you are. And so this third element of our mission, increasing cultural connections to gardening, intersects with the second and third ones. Delivered but not yet healed, and we were brought here to cultivate. And this is even harder stuff to process. I think that, I'm sorry?
I just wanted to say how much I appreciate all that you have brought to us today and how you have made all of these connections between how we are nourished and how we have our community and the connection to gardening and land. So it looks like we are running into time. But we could just keep going. We could keep going. I know that there's a number of questions that people have, and so I think what we'll do is we have a panel that will happen this afternoon, and I think that we will ask a lot of those questions this afternoon. So people, please, if you are in the conference or if you're joining us live on Facebook, please add your questions and we will ask those a little bit later.